descent into the Hadal abyss felt like entering another world. My name is Dr. Cassandra Vance, a marine biologist specializing in deep-sea ecosystems. I was aboard the Abyssal Horizon, an advanced deep-sea exploration vessel equipped with the finest technology money could buy. Our goal was to investigate a newly discovered trench off the coast of the Azores, an unexplored chasm dubbed the Devil's Rift. Its depth was estimated at over 12,000 meters, making it one of the deepest known places on Earth. The submersible Nereus 7 was a state-of-the-art vehicle capable of withstanding unimaginable pressure. It was equipped with robotic arms, high-resolution cameras, and sonar systems to map the terrain. Along with me in the cramped capsule were Dr. Anton Rivas, a geologist with a penchant for conspiracy theories, and Lieutenant Mark Delaney, our pilot, a no-nonsense Navy veteran who had seen more than he cared to talk about as we descended. The faint sunlight filtering through the water vanished quickly, plunging us into darkness. The sub's external lights pierced through the void, illuminating drifting clouds of plankton and occasional schools of bioluminescent fish. The hum of the engines and the rhythmic ping of sonar were the only sounds accompanying our descent. "Pressure's holding steady," Delaney announced as we hit the 7,000-meter mark. "Just a couple more hours to the bottom." Anton tapped the screen displaying the sonar readouts. "Something strange here," he muttered. His tone unusually tense. I glanced at the screen. The sonar was showing an anomaly, a vast, uneven structure that stretched across the trench floor. The readings suggested it was enormous, larger than any known shipwreck or natural formation. "Could it be a volcanic structure?" I asked. "Maybe," Anton replied, but his expression didn't inspire confidence as we neared the trench floor. The temperature gauges on the console began fluctuating wildly. The water should have been near freezing, yet pockets of inexplicably warm currents began registering. A soft vibration resonated through the sub, faint but noticeable, as though something massive stirred in the deep. "That's odd," Delaney said, frowning at the controls. "We're picking up some interference. Could be geological activity, or something else," Anton added, almost under his breath. The lights illuminated the seabed, revealing a barren expanse of fine silt broken by jagged rock formations. But as we moved closer to the sonar anomaly, the terrain began to change. Massive ridges jutted up like the bones of some ancient leviathan, and the silt gave way to a dark, glassy surface. "What is that?" I whispered, my breath fogging the glass of my helmet. The cameras captured the landscape in startling detail. The surface we were approaching wasn't rock. It was metallic, a vast structure encrusted with centuries of sediment and marine growth. It was riddled with unnatural patterns, almost like glyphs or carvings. "No way this is natural," Anton said, his voice trembling. "This is something else. Something built." "Built by what?" Delaney asked. His tone was calm, but his hands gripped the controls tightly. I leaned closer to the viewport. The markings on the structure were strangely organic, spiraling and branching like veins. The more I stared, the more uneasy I felt, as if the patterns were shifting imperceptibly, playing tricks on my eyes. Delaney guided the submersible toward an opening, a massive circular entrance that seemed to lead into the structure. "You want to go in?" he asked. "We have to," Anton said. "This could be the discovery of the century." I hesitated but ultimately nodded. Curiosity had gotten the better of me. The sub's lights illuminated the entrance as we passed through. Inside, the walls were lined with the same vein-like patterns, but here they pulsed faintly with a bioluminescent glow, casting eerie shadows. The space widened into a massive chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. This can't be real," Anton stammered, his voice filled with awe and fear. The chamber was filled with monolithic structures arranged in a circular pattern, each one covered in the same glyph-like carvings. At the center of the circle was an obelisk, towering over the others, its surface gleaming as if untouched by time. "Those readings are going haywire," Delaney muttered, pointing to the monitors. The temperature, pressure, and magnetic field sensors were all fluctuating erratically as we hovered closer to the obelisk. A sudden vibration shook the submersible. The lights flickered, and an ear-splitting screech reverberated through the chamber. "What the hell was that?" Delaney shouted, gripping the controls as the sub lurched violently. "I don't know," I yelled, trying to steady myself. The screeching grew louder, a cacophony of sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The glyphs on the obelisk began to glow brighter, their patterns shifting in a way that defied logic. "Something's moving," Anton said, his voice barely audible over the noise. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. Shadows began to coalesce around the chamber, forming shapes that were both alien and terrifyingly familiar. They moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace, circling the submersible like sharks. "Get us out of here now," I screamed. Delaney didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the controls forward, and the sub lurched toward the entrance. But the shadows followed, their forms growing more distinct with every passing second. They were humanoid but twisted, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. The screeching grew deafening as one of the shapes lunged at the sub, slamming into it with enough force to send us spiraling. The lights flickered again, plunging us into brief darkness. When they came back on, the shadows were gone. "Did we lose them?" Anton whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, a low rumble echoed through the trench. The obelisk's glow intensified, casting the chamber in a blinding light. And then we saw it. From the depths of the structure emerged something colossal, a shape so vast and alien that my mind struggled to comprehend it. Its many eyes glistened like black pearls, and its body undulated with a terrifying, otherworldly rhythm. "We have to go," I screamed, but the sub's engines sputtered and died. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed us was a voice, deep, resonant, and impossibly ancient, speaking words I could not understand. When I woke up, the world was silent and I was still in the submersible, but something was wrong. The lights were dim, flickering intermittently, and the monitors displayed nothing but static. My ears were ringing, and every joint in my body ached as if I had been crushed under a great weight. "Anton? Delaney?" I croaked, my voice barely audible in the oppressive quiet. Anton sat slumped in his seat, his face ashen and his eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. Delaney was still at the controls, gripping them with white-knuckled intensity. Neither of them responded. "Delaney!" I shouted, shaking his shoulder that he stirred, his head snapping toward me. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expression was wild, as if he had seen something he couldn't unsee. We have to get out of here," he muttered, his voice trembling. "What happened?" I asked, glancing around. "The thing," he said, his voice cracking. It touched us. I felt it in my head, in my thoughts. "We need to leave now." I turned to Anton, but something about him stopped me cold. His lips were moving, forming silent words, and his eyes glowed faintly with the same bioluminescent hue as the glyphs on the obelisk. "Anton," I whispered, but he didn't respond. He just kept muttering, his hands twitching erratically. "Forget him," Delaney barked. "He's gone. It's in him now." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, but Delaney ignored me, frantically pressing buttons on the console. The engines groaned to life, but the sub lurched violently, as if something was holding it in place. The external lights flickered, revealing the chamber outside. The shadows had returned, circling us in an almost ritualistic manner. The obelisk loomed in the distance, its glyphs pulsating in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. Then the voice returned that it was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the walls of the sub, bypassing my ears and resonating directly in my skull. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. "We see you. We know you." Anton's muttering grew louder, and his movements became more erratic. His eyes rolled back into his head as he began convulsing. "It's calling," he rasped, his voice distorted and layered, as if someone or something else was speaking through him. "It wants us." Suddenly, the subsystems went haywire. Alarms blared, and the controls sparked as the pressure gauges shot into the red. Delaney fought to keep the sub stable, But it was no use. The walls groaned under the immense force, and I could feel the cold seep in through the cracks. The voice grew louder, more insistent. The shadows pressed closer, their forms becoming more defined. They weren't just humanoid. They were grotesque, a nightmarish amalgamation of human and marine life. Tentacles writhed from their torsos, and their elongated faces bore rows of needle-like teeth. One of them pressed its face against the viewport, staring directly at me with glowing, unblinking eyes. I screamed, scrambling back, but there was nowhere to go. Delaney slammed his fist against the console. "We're not dying here," he roared, pushing the engines to their limit. The sub surged forward, breaking free from whatever force was holding it. The shadows howled in unison, a sound that made my bones ache. The obelisk's glow intensified, and the chamber began to collapse. Massive chunks of the structure fell away, vanishing into the abyss below. The shadows retreated, but not before one of them lashed out, its clawed hand striking the sub. The impact sent us spinning out of control. "Hold on," Delaney shouted as he fought to stabilize the sub. The descent was chaotic, a whirlwind of darkness and flashing lights. The instruments were useless, and the external cameras showed nothing but a swirling void. I clung to my seat, praying we wouldn't be crushed by the pressure. Finally, we leveled out, the sub coming to a jarring halt on the seabed. The silence that followed was deafening. Are we alive?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Delaney didn't answer. He slumped back in his seat, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. I checked the monitors. Most of them were fried, but one of the external cameras was still operational. The view it displayed made my blood run cold that we weren't alone. The shadows had followed us, surrounding the sub in an impenetrable wall. They didn't move, just stared, their glowing eyes fixed on us. Anton began laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "It's too late," he said, his voice unnaturally deep. "You can't escape it. It's part of you now." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, but he just kept laughing. The voice returned, louder than ever. This time I understood the words. "You are ours." The sub shook violently, and the walls began to buckle. Delaney grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to abandon the sub," he said. "Are you insane?" I shouted. "We'll die out there. We'll die in here too," he snapped. Before I could argue, the hull cracked, and freezing water began to pour in. Delaney yanked open the emergency hatch, releasing the escape pod. He shoved me inside, but when he turned to grab Anton, the scientist lunged at him, his face twisted in a monstrous grin. "You can't leave," Anton hissed, his voice layered with inhuman tones. "It's already begun." Delaney shoved him away and climbed into the pod, slamming the hatch shut as the sub began to implode. The last thing I saw through the viewport was Anton's face, distorted and otherworldly, as the shadows consumed him. The pod shot upward, propelled by a compressed air system. Delaney and I clung to the sides, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The ascent felt endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Finally, the pod breached the surface, and we were bathed in the blinding light of the sun. A rescue team aboard the abyssal horizon pulled us aboard, their faces pale with concern, but I couldn't feel relief. Even now, as I sit here recounting this nightmare, I can feel it. Something followed us back. At night, I hear the voice, whispering in the shadows, and in the stillness of the deep, I know it waits. When I joined the crew of the Calypso Horizon, I thought it would be the opportunity of a lifetime. The vessel was one of the most advanced marine research ships in the world, and we were heading into the Mariana Trench to investigate a series of unexplainable sonar anomalies detected at unprecedented depths. It was supposed to be groundbreaking, a glimpse into a part of the world no human had ever explored. Instead, it became a waking nightmare. I am Dr. Eva Langston, an acoustic specialist and oceanographer. My job was to analyze the strange sounds that had been recorded from the trench. At first, I assumed they were natural phenomena, tectonic activity, maybe the calls of some elusive deep-sea species. But as the recordings played through the ship's sound system, my excitement turned to unease. The sounds were melodic, almost like a song, but layered with something deeper, low, rumbling tones that resonated in a way no animal should be able to produce. The pattern was hypnotic, a series of undulating pitches that seemed almost intentional. "It's like music," I murmured during a briefing. "It's just the ocean playing tricks," said Captain Harris, a gruff man with decades of experience. "Sound behaves strangely down there." But it didn't feel like a trick. 2 days into our expedition, we launched the Perseus, an unmanned submersible, to capture live footage of the trench floor. The crew crowded around the monitors as the feed displayed jagged terrain covered in silt and the occasional bioluminescent creature. But as the Perseus descended further, the transmission began to glitch. The cameras flickered, and the audio feed was drowned out by that same strange melody, louder now, almost overwhelming. Then the screen went dark, and the Perseus stopped responding entirely. "What the hell happened?" Harris barked, his face tight with frustration. "I don't know," said Dr. Luis Mendez, our robotics expert. "It's like something interfered with the signal." A collective unease settled over the room. Losing an unmanned sub wasn't unheard of, but this felt different. "We're going down there," Harris declared. "We're not leaving without answers." That's how I found myself aboard the Triton II, the ship's state-of-the-art submersible, alongside Mendez and Lieutenant Joanna Pierce, our pilot. The Triton II was built for extreme depths, its titanium hull capable of withstanding the crushing pressure of the trench. Still, as we descended into the black abyss, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. The further we went, the darker it became. The sun's reach vanished quickly, replaced by the artificial glow of the sub's external lights. Occasionally, strange shapes flickered at the edges of our vision, unidentifiable creatures that disappeared before the cameras could capture them. "Depth, 9,000 meters, Joanna announced. The sonar pinged softly, mapping the terrain below. But as we approached the site where the Perseus was last detected, the sonar began to malfunction, displaying erratic signals. "That's not right," Mendez muttered, adjusting the settings. "What's not right?" I asked, gripping the armrest of my seat. "There's something big down there," he said, pointing at the screen. The sonar showed a massive, irregular shape, but the data was fragmented, almost as if the system couldn't make sense of what it was detecting. The melody returned, faint at first but growing louder as we descended. It was clearer now, hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed to vibrate through the sub's hull. "Do you hear that?" Joanna asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, my mouth dry. "It's the same sound from the recordings." As we neared the trench floor, the lights revealed a horrifying sight: the shattered remains of the Perseus. Its frame was mangled beyond recognition, as if it had been crushed by something with immense strength. "What could have done this?" Mendez whispered. None of us had an answer. The melody grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow it. It wasn't just a sound. It was a pull, like an invisible hand guiding me deeper. "There's something ahead," Joanna said, pointing to the viewport. The lights illuminated a vast, alien structure partially buried in the silt. It was an enormous spire, twisted and organic in design, with tendrils that seemed to grow out of its base and coil into the surrounding terrain. The spire pulsated faintly, emitting a bioluminescent glow that matched the rhythm of the melody. "That's not natural," Mendez said, his voice shaky. Before we could react, the melody shifted. It was no longer just a song. It was a voice, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to come from within our own minds. "Leave, or join us." The words were clear, spoken in a language I couldn't understand yet somehow comprehended. My heart pounded as I looked at Joanna and Mendez, their faces pale with fear. "Did you hear that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Joanna's hands trembled on the controls. "We need to go. Now." But the spire wasn't finished with us. The tendrils began to move, curling and twisting toward the sub. The sonar went wild, and the lights flickered as the sub shook violently. "Something's interfering with the systems," Mendez shouted, frantically trying to stabilize the controls. The tendrils wrapped around the sub, and the melody became a roar, deafening and relentless. I felt a pressure in my skull, as if something was trying to force its way into my mind. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I saw images. Alien landscapes, cities submerged in darkness, and creatures that defied all logic. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the spire released us. The sub spiraled out of control, the systems failing one by one. "Brace yourselves!" Joanna screamed as we plummeted deeper into the trench. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the melody fading into a soft, mournful hum. When I woke up, I was alone. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The sub wasn't moving. The hum of the engines, the steady ping of sonar, even the haunting melody. All of it was gone. For a brief moment, I thought I might be dead, but the cold metal seat beneath me and the faint taste of blood in my mouth quickly disabused me of that notion. "Joanna? Mendez?" I called out, my voice hoarse at no response. The interior lights flickered weakly, revealing the shattered remnants of the console. Joanna was slumped over the controls, motionless, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Mendez was sprawled on the floor, groaning softly, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Joanna!" I scrambled to her side and pressed my fingers to her neck. Relief flooded me when I felt a faint pulse. "Mendez, can you hear me?" I asked, crouching next to him. His eyelids fluttered open, and he winced. "What happened?" "We crashed," I said, helping him sit up. "The spire, those tendrils. Something attacked us." As I spoke, my words felt surreal, like I was recounting someone else's nightmare. Joanna stirred, groaning as she lifted her head. "Where are we?" she mumbled, her voice thick with pain. That I glanced out the viewport and froze. We were no longer in the trench. The sub rested on a rocky plateau, surrounded by an alien landscape unlike anything I had ever seen. Towering formations that resembled coral, but far too large and symmetrical, rose from the seabed. Strange, translucent creatures drifted through the water, their bodies pulsating with faint light. In the distance, the spire loomed, impossibly massive and pulsating with that same eerie glow. The melody returned, soft but insistent, vibrating through the walls of the sub. "It's still here," Joanna whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to figure out how to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mendez shook his head. "The systems are fried. Even if we could repair them, the pressure at this depth." A loud creak interrupted him, followed by a soft vibration beneath our feet. Something was moving outside the sub. I leaned closer to the viewport, my breath fogging the glass. The shadows that moved between the coral structures weren't just creatures. They were humanoid, their elongated bodies swaying with an unnatural grace. Their glowing eyes stared at us as they circled the sub, their movements deliberate, almost curious. "Are those the same things we saw before?" Joanna asked, her voice barely audible. "I think so," I said, though deep down I wasn't sure. These entities seemed more solid, more present, as if they had been waiting for us to arrive. One of the figures pressed its face against the viewport, its features grotesque and alien. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You are chosen." The sub shook violently, and the lights flickered again. Mendez screamed as one of the creatures reached out, its hand passing through the hull as if it were mist. The hand gripped his injured arm, and his scream turned to a gurgling gasp. I grabbed a wrench from the floor and swung it wildly, though I knew it was useless. The creature didn't flinch, its glowing eyes locked onto Mendez as his body went limp. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, taking him with it. "Mendez!" Joanna shrieked, clawing at the empty space where he had been. "We have to move!" I yelled, pulling her back. "They're not going to stop." But there was nowhere to go. The sub was dead, and the trench offered no escape. The creatures were closing in, their forms shimmering like reflections on water. The melody grew louder, almost unbearable, and I felt it pressing into my mind, pulling at my thoughts. Memories surfaced unbidden. Fragments of my childhood, my family, my dreams. The song was stripping me bare, unraveling everything that made me me. Joanna clutched her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. Make it stop," she cried, her voice breaking. I looked out the viewport and saw the spire glowing brighter, its tendrils writhing like a living thing. The melody wasn't just sound. It was a call, a summons we couldn't resist. "I think it wants us to go to it," I said, the realization chilling me to my core. "That's insane," Joanna snapped, her voice tinged with desperation. "We go there, we die. If we stay here, we die anyway," I said grimly, before she could argue. The sub lurched violently, as if dragged by an invisible current. The spire grew closer, its towering form dominating the view. The melody shifted again, becoming almost soothing. I felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability, as if this was always how it was meant to end. The sub came to a halt at the base of the spire, its tendrils curling around us like a predator inspecting its prey. The melody stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, I heard it, the voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into my mind. "You will join us. The sea claims all." The sub's hatch groaned as it was forced open, and icy water rushed in. Joanna screamed, clinging to me as the tendrils reached inside. I felt one wrap around my arm, its touch cold and electric. "Let me go!" I shouted, struggling against its grip. But as the tendril pulled me closer, I felt something else, an overwhelming sense of connection, as if the spire was part of something vast and eternal. Visions flooded my mind. A civilization older than time, submerged in darkness, waiting for the world above to fall into their grasp. Joanna's screams faded as she was dragged into the depths, her form dissolving into the glow of the spire. I tried to fight, but the pull was too strong. The last thing I saw before the light consumed me was the creatures surrounding the spire, their glowing eyes filled with something I couldn't comprehend. Not malice, not hatred, something far worse. Acceptance. That I woke up on the deck of the Calypso Horizon, gasping for air. The crew surrounded me, their faces filled with confusion and concern. "What happened?" Captain Harris asked. "Where's Mendez?" "Joanna?" I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. That I in the back of my mind. The melody lingered, faint but persistent. I could still feel the spire's presence, its tendrils wrapped around my thoughts. Even now, as I write this, I know the truth. I never truly left the trench, and neither will you. When the message first came through, no one believed it was a garbled transmission picked up by a deep-sea listening station in the North Atlantic. The audio was heavily distorted, but experts were able to extract a single, haunting phrase buried beneath the static. "Help us? They're coming." The origin of the signal was traced to a previously uncharted region of the ocean floor, over 6,000 meters deep. The location wasn't near any known submarine routes or research stations, which made its existence, and its ominous warning, all the more perplexing. I was recruited for the mission due to my expertise in underwater acoustics. My name is Dr. Elena Cross, and I've spent most of my career studying the sounds of the deep ocean. Whales, volcanic eruptions, even the enigmatic bloop. If it made a noise underwater, I was the one to analyze it. The Poseidon, our research vessel, was equipped for extreme depths, and its submersible Agur V could plunge to the darkest reaches of the ocean. My team consisted of Captain Bryce Carter, a hardened Navy man with a skeptical streak, Dr. Rami Hassan, a geologist, and Lieutenant Adrian Locke, our sub-pilot. Together, we set out to uncover the source of the transmission. The descent began at dawn as we sank into the depths. The world above faded into an endless void. The water turned inky black, broken only by the artificial glow of the sub's lights. The hum of the engine was a constant reminder of how fragile our vessel was in this alien environment. "Depth, 5,000 meters," Adrian announced, her voice calm but laced with tension. Anything on sonar? Bryce asked. I checked the monitors, my eyes scanning for anomalies. Just the usual, some small marine life and the seabed ahead. No sign of wreckage or activity. Rami leaned forward, squinting at the readings. The geology down here is unusual. There's a massive ridge system, almost like a natural wall. The ridge came into view moments later, illuminated by the sub's powerful beams. It stretched endlessly in both directions, its surface jagged and covered in a thick layer of silt. Strange, coral-like growths clung to its edges, glowing faintly with a bioluminescent shimmer. Looks like the ocean's version of a fortress, Adrian remarked, her hands steady on the controls. That's an apt description, Rami replied. It almost feels constructed. Constructed. The word hung in the air, stirring unease in all of us. The signal grew stronger as we approached the ridge. My equipment picked up faint echoes, rhythmic and deliberate, as though something beyond the ridge was sending out pulses. What's causing that? Bryce asked, leaning over my shoulder. I don't know, I admitted. But it's not natural. It's too regular, too precise. As we passed over the ridge, the sonar lit up with activity. Shapes began to appear. Large, irregular structures that didn't match any known geological formations. Is that a settlement? Adrian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It can't be, Rami said, though his tone suggested he wasn't so sure. The lights revealed an otherworldly scene. Massive towers rising from the seabed, their surfaces covered in what looked like runes or carvings. The architecture was alien, with curved spires and arches that defied conventional design. The structures seemed ancient, as if they had been submerged for millennia. This is incredible, Rami breathed, his eyes wide with awe. It's not on any charts, Bryce muttered. How could something like this go unnoticed? The answer came unbidden to my mind. It wasn't meant to be found. The transmission grew louder, filling the sub with a low, mournful hum. The sound wasn't just audible. It was visceral, vibrating through the walls and into our bones. It's coming from the center of the city? I said, pointing to a massive structure at the heart of the settlement. It was shaped like an enormous dome, with jagged spires protruding from its surface. Adrian guided the sub toward the dome, but as we approached, the lights began to flicker. The temperature inside the cabin dropped, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. Something's interfering with the systems, Adrian said, her hands tightening on the controls. The sonar feed scrambled, replaced by a single, haunting image. An enormous, writhing shape deep beneath the city. What the hell is that? Bryce demanded, his voice sharp. It's moving, Rami said, his face pale. Before we could react, the hum transformed into a deafening roar. The sub shook violently, and I was thrown from my seat. Through the viewport, I saw the towers begin to glow, their runes pulsating with an eerie light. Pull us back, Bryce shouted, but Adrian was already struggling with the controls. It's not responding, she cried, her voice edged with panic. The ground beneath the city split open, and a massive, black tendril emerged, writhing and twisting with an unnatural grace. More tendrils followed, reaching out toward the sub. Hold on, Adrian yelled as the sub lurched sideways, narrowly avoiding one of the appendages. The tendrils weren't just physical. They carried a presence, something ancient and malevolent that pressed into my mind. Images flooded my thoughts. A civilization consumed by its own hubris, a darkness they had unleashed, and a warning too late to save them. Help us! They're coming. The message wasn't from the city. It was from its victims. The tendrils wrapped around the sub, their grip crushing. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness as alarms blared. I felt the air grow thinner, colder, as the crushing pressure of the deep began to seep in. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The tendrils retreated, and the sub was released. The lights flickered back on, revealing the city below. The towers were dark now, the runes extinguished, but the dome remained illuminated. We need to leave, Bryce said, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. "No," I said, surprising even myself. "We're here for answers. We have to see what's inside that dome." Bryce stared at me, then nodded reluctantly. "Make it quick." Adrian piloted the sub toward the dome, its entrance gaping like a maw. The melody returned, softer this time, almost inviting that as we crossed the threshold. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. And then we saw them. Rows of humanoid figures lined the walls, their bodies encased in a translucent material. Their eyes were open, glowing faintly, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. "They're alive," Rami whispered. "They were trying to escape," I said, my voice trembling. The realization hit me like a wave. The message wasn't a warning to us. It was a warning to stay away, but it was too late. The figures trapped in the walls stared at us with glowing eyes, their expressions frozen in terror. Their translucent prisons pulsed faintly, almost like they were alive. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching us, waiting for something. "They're alive," Rami repeated, his voice barely audible. "Not alive," Bryce said, his tone grim. "Something else. We shouldn't be here." But I couldn't tear my gaze away. The melody, the signal that had drawn us here, was louder now, resonating through my mind like a siren's call. It wasn't just sound. It was a message, and the longer I listened, the more I understood. "They're trying to warn us?" I whispered. "Warn us about what?" Adrian asked, her hands gripping the controls as she kept the sub steady. I glanced back at the figures. Their bodies were distorted, their limbs elongated and their faces grotesquely warped. Whatever had trapped them here hadn't just preserved them, it had changed them. "About that," Rami said, pointing to the far side of the chamber. A massive structure dominated the center of the dome, rising like an altar. It was made of the same organic material as the city's towers, its surface covered in intricate runes that pulsed in time with the melody. At its base lay a dark, swirling pool, its surface unervingly still despite the movement in the water around it. The pool rippled as we approached, and a shape began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. But as it rose, its form became clear. A massive humanoid figure, its body covered in the same glowing runes that adorned the altar. Its eyes opened, twin orbs of burning light that seemed to pierce through the sub and into my very soul. "We need to leave," Bryce said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Adrian didn't need to be told twice. She spun the sub around and pushed the controls forward, but the engines sputtered and died. "What's happening?" she shouted, frantically pressing buttons. "The systems are fried," Rami said, panic rising in his voice. The figure stepped forward, the pool rippling as it moved. Tendrils of darkness extended from its body, reaching out like fingers. The melody grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt my mind slipping, fragments of memories and thoughts unraveling like threads. "It's in our heads," I said, clutching my temples. "Focus, Langston," Bryce barked. "Don't let it take you." I looked up, forcing myself to think, to fight against the pull of the melody. The figures in the walls weren't just warnings. They were the result of whatever this thing was. It had consumed them, turned them into part of itself. "We have to stop it," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "The altar, it's connected to that thing. If we destroy it, maybe we can break its hold." "Are you insane?" Bryce snapped. "How are we supposed to destroy anything in a dead sub at the bottom of the ocean?" But Adrian had already started working. "The sub still has a manual targeting system for the external manipulator arm. If I can aim it at the altar, we might be able to use the plasma cutter." "It's a long shot," Bryce said, but there was no better option. "Do it." Adrian activated the manual controls, and the arm extended toward the altar. The plasma cutter sparked to life, its blue flame illuminating the chamber. The figure reacted immediately. The tendrils lashed out, slamming against the sub with enough force to make the hull groan. The lights flickered, and I could feel the pressure mounting. "Hurry!" I shouted as the melody became a roar, the force of it vibrating through my bones. Adrian fired the cutter, and a beam of searing light struck the base of the altar. The runes flared bright, and the tendrils recoiled, writhing in agony. "It's working!" Rami shouted. But the figure wasn't done. It let out a deafening scream, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a wave of pure, primal fear that froze us in place. The tendrils struck again, harder this time, and the hull began to buckle. "Keep firing!" Bryce yelled, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Adrian adjusted the cutter, aiming for the center of the altar. The beam struck true, and the runes began to crack. Their light flickering, the figure let out another scream, this one tinged with desperation. The tendrils recoiled entirely, and the figures in the walls began to dissolve, their glowing eyes dimming. "We're breaking its hold," I said, hope surging through me. But as the altar crumbled, the figure lunged forward, its massive form looming over the sub. It was weaker now, its movements sluggish, but its intent was clear. If it couldn't consume us, it would destroy us. "Brace for impact," Bryce shouted. The figure struck the sub, and the impact sent us spiraling. The lights went out completely, and the cabin filled with the sound of groaning metal. Then silence. For a moment, I thought we were dead. But as the emergency lights flickered on, I realized the figure was gone. The altar had collapsed entirely, and the pool was empty, its dark surface replaced by stillness. "It's over," Adrian said, her voice shaky. But I wasn't so sure. We managed to restart the engines and ascend, leaving the city behind. As we rose through the water, the melody faded, replaced by an eerie quiet. Back on the Poseidon, the crew greeted us with relief and confusion. They hadn't heard the signal since we entered the dome, and the sonar anomalies had ceased. But something felt wrong. Even now, I can hear the faintest hum at the edge of my thoughts, like a song I can't quite forget. That we destroyed the altar, but I know we didn't destroy it. The abyss isn't done with us. Not yet.